Welcome to HDTV. You now rocking with your boy. Now, basically, a news report from the Business Insider came across my screen, and people need to listen to this and go read it. It's how decades of U.S. welfare policies lifted up the white middle class and largely excluded Black Americans. So basically, this is a story done by Margaret Ward, and it was published yesterday, August 11, 2020 at 9:40 a.m. So, basically what she said was when President Donald Trump met with the Congressional Black Caucus in 2018, the topic of welfare reform came up. One member of the caucus told Trump that enforcing stricter rules would be detrimental to her constituents, not all of whom are Black, according to NBC News. The president is said to have replied, "Really? Then what are they?" Apparently assuming that a welfare recipient couldn't be white. In fact, far more white people have benefited from U.S. welfare programs over the years, reflecting their greater share of the population, while Black people and other people of color have been denied them in various ways. Multiple historians and researchers tell Business Insider the coronavirus pandemic has exposed the underbelly of American inequality in many ways, with people of color disproportionately likely to be laid off, to be on the financial brink, and to die from the virus. That has helped prompt a growing chorus of financiers, business leaders, and regular folks to call for a reimagining of American capitalism and for moves to end racial inequality. Some top economists are calling for a New Deal, specifically targeting inequality, a platform to which the Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden seems open. If the country is to move forward in trying to lift Americans out of unemployment and poverty, policymakers might consider who has benefited most from past welfare policies and how such policies have helped produce today's world. Business Insider talked to 4 economic researchers and historians and analyzed the past 90 years of welfare policy when considering the question of who the status quo actually benefits. Stanford Schramm, a political science professor at CUNY Hunter, who wrote Disciplining the Poor and Hard White, puts it bluntly. I do think the federal government has been complicit in the perpetuation of race-based discrimination that has led to African Americans lagging behind whites, no question about it. The New Deal brought jobs to Americans, but different kinds of jobs for different races. The U.S. government has spent trillions of dollars trying to prop up its economy during the coronavirus pandemic, but it has stopped short of a wartime economy-style mobilization or the kind of massive public works program that some experts have said is badly needed to stem double-digit unemployment. But the Black Lives Matter movement, given new urgency after George Floyd's killing by the police in Minneapolis in late May, has exposed a separate problematic legacy of the New Deal. The series of policies enacted by President Franklin D. Roosevelt to get the U.S. out of the Great Depression of the 1930s. It was introduced in an era defined by segregation and explicit racism. It's true that Roosevelt appointed several Black leaders to prominent leadership positions within his administration, known as the Black Cabinet, and his policies helped make thousands of jobs newly available to Black Americans. But as Ibram X. Kendi points out in Stamped from the Beginning, policies enacted at the time reflected a racist culture. When the New Deal got Americans back to work, white Americans got the first pick at jobs. And when Black Americans did get jobs, they were given lower wages, according to the University of Houston's Digital History Project. State and local governments administered almost all federal New Deal programs, and many of these state and local government leaders, especially in the South, were virtually all white and racist. Gary Orfield, a professor of education, law, political science, and urban planning at the University of California at Los Angeles, told Business Insider. Also, black people were excluded from key benefits created during this period. The Social Security Act of 1935, for instance, prohibited domestic and agricultural workers, an outside number of whom were black or Latino, from receiving benefits. Black workers were also excluded from progressive labor regulations passed during that time. Paul Moreno, a history professor who is the dean of social sciences at Hillsdale College, told Business Insider the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, commonly known as the Wagner Act, for Senator Robert Wagner, who proposed it, bolstered the strength of worker unions, but many major unions of this era either excluded black workers or discriminated against them. Many unions had explicit clauses in their constitutions that said that only whites could be members. Moreno said, so you could have a situation where an employer was forced to bargain with an exclusively white union and he'd have to fire all of his black employees. Because discrimination was still legal when it came to jobs, black Americans were routinely denied well-paying positions and were much more likely to be hired for low-wage work, according to Orfield, the professor at UCLA. A lot of policies were designed that simply left out black Americans who were sharecroppers and were doing low-wage work, which was excluded from some of the labor regulations, he said. Elsewhere in the economy, interpretation of New Deal policies wound up hurting black Americans. The Federal Housing Administration was created in this era with the goal of creating affordable housing for as many Americans as possible. But local interpretation of this mission resulted in redlining, a policy in which mortgage credit was denied in majority black neighborhoods. The FHA continued to encourage racist policies into the post-war era. When the American suburbs were being built, in 1948, the Supreme Court outlawed restrictive covenants, a clause that essentially prevented black Americans from buying property from white owners. Yet the FHA still encouraged building to write them into their agreements well past 1948, according to Orfield. We want white tenants in our white community is a sign that they put up. White veterans of World War II were given zero down payment, 30-year guarantee mortgages under the GI Bill. With zero cash, white veterans, could get into owning a brand new home, Orfield told Business Insider. That door was not open for black and Latinos. A house someone bought at the time for $12,000 or $15,000 in mortgage payments, he said, might be worth $300,000 decades later. That's a gigantic wealth creator and a gigantic middle class escalator, he said. One black Americans missed out on and couldn't pass along to their children. Welfare reform greatly benefited black Americans and was almost immediately unpopular for it. One of the largest government programs in the post-New Deal era, President Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society, sought to remedy the racial wealth gap. During the 1960s, the median black family income rose 53%, while black employment doubled in professional, technical, and clerical occupations, and average black educational attainment increased by 4 years. University of Houston history professor Wright, the proportion of black people below the poverty line went from 55% in 1960 to just 27% by 1968. Even at the height of the Great Society, black Americans constituted only about 27% of all welfare recipients, according to Sundiata Keita Chajua, an associate history professor at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Most recipients were white Americans. From the Great Society moving forward, one could say that white people, because of their numbers and percentage of the population, have always constituted the largest number of people on welfare. Chajua told Business Insider, adding that black people, Latins, American Indians, because of their oppressed condition, have constituted a much greater percentage than their percent of their population. But as the anti-discriminatory practices from Johnson's presidency were enforced and Black Americans were allowed to participate in new benefit programs, there was a dramatic shift in public perception about government subsidies to the negative. Public assistance was not as demonized until African Americans began to exercise their right to use it, ironically, Scram said. And that's when welfare started to be seen as this inferior program for non-white people who didn't play by the white middle class rules of work and family. This shift was propelled forward by President Ronald Reagan, whose campaign speeches about the now debunked welfare queen stoked racism fear among white Americans. He really tightened the eligibility requirement, Scram said. He made it more difficult for you to get welfare even after you started to work. For example, Reagan cut spending to the Aid to Families with Dependent Children program, which provided cash assistance to low-income children whose father or mother was absent from the home, incapacitated, deceased, or unemployed. This forced struggling mothers and families further into poverty. Research funded by the Ford Foundation found. The social welfare policy researcher Sandra Emmons Crew, who is the dean of Howard University's School of Social Work, describes such policies by conservative policymakers as a direct response to Black participation in the system. There is always a backlash that comes after progression. Always, Crew told Business Insider, likening the backlash against welfare expansion to the resurgence of white nationalism in response to Barack Obama's presidency. Instead of receiving an opportunity to be lifted out of poverty, many Black Americans remain disenfranchised. Reagan's legacy, however, was solidified by Democratic President Bill Clinton, who promised to change welfare as we have come to know it by replacing the Aid to Families with Dependent Children program with a temporary assistance for needy families block grant. He dramatically reduced the size of welfare programs. TANF really did change welfare as we knew it, Schramm said. Before Clinton, about 75% of people who were eligible for welfare were receiving it. But by 2000, 4 years after Clinton's program was enacted, only about 25% were, Schramm research found. In other words, at a time when Black Americans were given significantly more access to public assistance, measures were enacted to make assistance harder to access. When we do get included in the welfare state in the Great Society programs, we are stigmatized for it. Child Jua, who is Black, said, "How's this legacy is playing out today? The racial wealth gap in the U.S. not only persists, it's growing. For every $100 in wealth held by a white family today, a Black family has just $10, per research from the Federal Reserve's 2017 Survey of Consumer Finances. A recent analysis of home ownership by the Fed noted that home ownership by race seems similar to the wealth distribution by race. Home ownership rates in the U.S., non-Hispanic, white alone, 60% or higher. Black or African American alone is 40%, barely. The difference in home ownership can also be seen at the geographic level, per research from Urban Institute. Home ownership rates by city. White ownership rate is 75% in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Black home ownership rate is 25%. In Albany, New York, 69% white home ownership rate. In Black home ownership rate is at 20%. Buffalo, New York is at 73%, while Blacks are at 29%. Whites in Salisbury, Maryland is at 81%, while Blacks are at 38%. And Bridgeport, Connecticut, whites are at 77%, while Blacks are at 34%. So today, white people still make up a plurality of those on welfare programs such as TANF or the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. A Department of Agriculture report from November estimated that 35.7% of SNAP recipients in the 2018 fiscal year were white, 25.1% were Black, 16.7% were Hispanic, 3% were Asian, and 1.5% were Native American. 0.8% were listed as multiple races, while 17.4% were listed as race unknown. Enrollment by race for Medicaid and the Special Supplemental Nutrition Program for women, infants, and children show similar enrollment as those in SNAP. Now, Black people make up just 13.4% of the U.S. population and are therefore overrepresented in welfare programs. When asked why this was the case, crew of Howard University had a simple answer: systematic inequality. Let me say that again if you've stuck around this long. When asked why this was the case, crew of Howard University had a simple answer: systematic inequality. Without more intervention, inequality will continue to reproduce itself, crew said. Orfield of UCLA agreed. This is especially true today as Congress decides whether to give Americans cash assistance after the temporary $600 increase weekly unemployment benefits expired July 31st. Black and brown workers are more likely to report being in financial hardship right now. A survey by the organization Lean In with SurveyMonkey in early April, people found that Black women were twice as likely as white men to say they were laid off or furloughed during the pandemic. New analysis by the global advisory firm Stout Ricius Ross found that only 26% of African American tenants said they felt highly confident they could pay their mortgage payments on time right now, compared with almost half of white Americans, CNBC reports. My view of this, Orfield said, is if you're in a society that's completely stratified by race and ethnicity, basically what you got is a system that guarantees inequality unless you specifically decide to change it. So, if you stuck around this long for this long soliloquy, thank you, I appreciate it. My thing is, I've been saying this for years, that we are in a systematic racism where they want to keep the Black man down. If you keep the Black man down, or when you take him out the household, it weakens the Black community. And that's their whole ideal of what they wanted to do. And it shows here that on welfare, it's more whites on welfare than Blacks. But they're showing in the news Blacks because they psychologically want to put in your head that white people are too good for this while Black people have to depend on welfare. When that's not the case. It's more of them than us, so it's more of them basically on welfare and getting all these assistances than we are. Now, the $1 trillion they're putting in, I keep saying, that's how much they owe us. They owe us hundreds of trillions of dollars in reparations. We want our 40 acres and a mule, and we need to fight for it. I'm telling you, this is what we need to fight for. If we fight for this, come together and fight for it, and keep fighting for it, it's going to make them look into it. Because look, they're getting trillions of dollars now, and America's in debt. Where are they getting this money from? And when they get this loan from other countries, they're pocketing it. They're not giving it to the citizens. They're holding that money to themselves. That's why when you guys put all your money into these organizations to say they're helping the kids or they're helping the fund, I don't believe that. I like if I'm giving my money to a children's hospital, I want to go to the hospital to see what's going on with the kids. Are they getting better? Are they doing better? What have you gotten for the kids from the use of my money and other hundreds of thousands of Americans? But what do you feel? Do you feel like systematic racism exists? Me, I believe it does. Let me know how you feel about the article in the comment section. Please subscribe and share, and please like this post. Like this video, please. I want it to get out to everybody. And subscribe. Please hit that notification bell. Once you hit that bell, make sure that you select all so you can receive all notifications of videos that I'm dropping. And again, thank you for listening, and sorry to make it so long for you, but it was needed to be said. Thank you for listening. We're out. Live boy.